Thank you everyone for coming. If you don't know me, I'm Ted Ekkers. I'm the president of the Historical Society, and we have a great event tonight. I wanted to quickly start off with some thank yous. I wanted to thank Kathy Johnson and Joanna McPeak, who are on the programming committee with the Historical Society, and they've been very helpful with this event. John McHugh at ParkTV. I'm going to give a 20-minute, 130-year lesson of development in St. Louis Park. I'm going to focus on 5 major topics or themes that I've found really interesting: industrial, commercial, residential, schools, and transportation. And so those 5 topics you'll hear come up again and again. That means I'm leaving a lot of stuff out. I'm leaving out religious institutions, neighborhoods, parks, et cetera, including a lot of the politics behind these decisions along the way. So bear with me while I go very quickly. We do have 2 events coming up. Kathy Johnson, who's an archivist, will be hosting this first event in November 14th. It'll be a fun workshop in time for Thanksgiving. If you're interested in sharing some family history, she's going to share creative ideas for how to share that. It might be quilts or marriage certificates or photos. So you can come to that workshop on the 14th at our office. And then December 5th, we're trying something new at the depot. We're going to be doing a lighting ceremony. We're going to light the depot for the holidays, just to kind of celebrate it, add a little something to that neighborhood. So we hope you'll come out, join us for hot cocoa and for a brief lighting ceremony. And on November 12th is Minnesota Give to the Max Day. We need your support. We would love that. If you're not aware of it, it's a statewide giving day for nonprofits. So we will be active on there. Look for us and include us in your year-end giving. Okay, so a brief history of development of St. Louis Park. It starts in 1884 when the area is surveyed, and the village is founded in 1886 by Joseph Hamilton. He was an instrumental founder, and he really is kind of the first in development for us. He was a developer himself. He built many homes, one of which shown here, which was his home and still stands today at 5900 Goodrich. He was our first mayor. He had the first general store in the area. So he kind of gets the ball rolling in terms of development. So in 1886, we have 350 people. It's made up of 45 families, so pretty small. You can see on the map or a schematic, there's not much there. Minnetonka Boulevard is there, Excelsior Boulevard, or might be more of a dirt road at that point, obviously. And there's 2 railroad paths, but you'll notice a very east-west orientation. This was to get goods from here to Minneapolis and vice versa. So very east-west. And then there's 3 schools at that time: North Side, Manhattan Park, and Pratt. Pratt being the oldest and the original school. The biggest and really most impactful development project was by T.B. Walker in 1890. He, with other investors like Thomas Lowry and Charles Pilbury, they buy up 1,700 acres of land right in the heart of St. Louis Park. And their vision is to establish an industrial city, like a Pullman city in Chicago, where there would be factories and the housing surrounding it for those workers. In the middle, you can see kind of the round parts. The reddish pink is the railroad going through, and there's some spurs coming off of that, all to service the industrial buildings that would be there. And then you can see the land plotted around it. So that circle is essentially where the traffic circle of Highway 7 is today. So they have this vision, but before it can become a reality, in 1893, a financial panic hits. And so Walker's kind of bust, and he has to sell off a lot of things. But he did have a very lasting impact on residential, industrial, commercial, transportation, and schools, which we'll see in a minute here. So the first is his influence on housing. Before he skipped town, he was able to build about 100 homes around the neighborhood, and these are called Walker homes, is what we call them. And they're very narrow, tall buildings. So they're 2-story, shotgun houses, 2 rooms down below, 2 rooms up, a side entrance, which is pretty unusual, a privy out back, and some are double lots so that people could have a garden next by. But you still see these out here, and so you can see that influence today in the neighborhoods, primarily in South Oak Hill and Elmwood neighborhoods. Of course, he had the vision of an industrial town. There was this industrial circle. And so while Walker didn't come through with any businesses, there were many others who did come through. There were businesses like Minneapolis Jarless Spring Carriage Company. Monitor Drill was a big employer for many years, and others. For commercial, the main street was called Broadway at the time. Today it's called Walker Street, appropriately enough. And this is the commercial hub of the city. On the left of this picture, the north or the top side is the original Walker building, and it still stands today. And the one south of that, on the other side of the street, is Hamilton's building. So the two major people built their big brick buildings across from one another. And that was really the downtown for St. Louis Park in the early 1900s. Now, businesses at that time in St. Louis Park are mostly just neighborhood grocers, like Swenson Radine, pictured here, but you start seeing other businesses come through, and a very famous one that was here for many decades was Doc Brown's Barbershop and Pool Hall. And there's a whole nother presentation we could do on that. This is kind of the start of more of non-grocer commercial. On transportation, Walker's idea was to have a trolley car, and they did build a trolley car. It went up Lake Street. So think right outside the school here, right up Lake Street. And so that trolley car was there to bring people from the city to the jobs at the industrial plants here. If this sounds familiar, it's probably because you're thinking of our light rail, which will do the same thing. Of course, with this trolley line brings the ability for other commercial to develop along that line as well. So by 1910, here we are at about 1,700 people. And that's 5 times the population than just 24 years earlier. And in the map, you can see the box, which is approximately where T.B. Walker's industrial village, where he had bought up all that land. And in the heart of that is some industrial and commercial. And then you have 3 new schools. The dark red ones are new schools. Lincoln, Oak Hill, and Fern Hill are all built. 2 of the other schools had closed by this time. Walker's impact on schools was that for a tax relief in 1912, he gave some land in his area to build what was the high school. Today, that is Central Community Center. So this is the original building of Central Community Center. There were some proposals to call it Walker High School, but it was just simply called the high school. Those are some of the big impacts left by Walker. Another big development in terms of transportation is the Dam Patch Line, which is the railroad that goes north-south through St. Louis Park. And it's another one that kind of forever shapes our city. And this happens in 1915 when M.W. Savage builds what's supposed to be a passenger railroad from Minneapolis down to his racetrack down in Savage for people to go visit his famous racehorse, Dam Patch. Well, it only took a year for the railroad to decide that they could make a lot more money by having industrial freight and use steam locomotives, which leaves a lot of dirt and oily smoke all over the laundry hanging in yards all around St. Louis Park. So that was from day one or year one, a pretty contentious railroad line. We have a long history of contentious with railroad lines. Another big one is just the following year, 1916, is Republic creosoting. So again, industrial is a big part of St. Louis Park's history. While maybe controversial today, this was a major employer for St. Louis Park. It would become later known for a lot of contamination and was one of the original Superfund sites. It was a major player in St. Louis Park's development history. We start seeing some school growth in the 20s. You have Brookside and Elliott and Lenox come up, and so pretty quickly, and obviously schools follow population. Small businesses are also starting to come online at this time. All along Excelsior Boulevard is the big area where we start seeing this. And so here's Al's Liquor Store, which was here for a long time. During this time, it was liquor stores, bars, and gas stations that was getting built a lot. It was the era of Prohibition, but Parkites were pretty clever to get around some of that. So Al's Cafe was a confectionery, but you could conveniently get a drink in the basement. So by 1930, here we are, a population of 4,700. It's now tripled in the past 20 years. And 4 schools were built, like I had mentioned. We have another factory, the creosote plant. We see the railroad coming north-south through the city. And you see in a little area along Excelsior Boulevard with commercial. So it's starting to fill in a little bit. So by 1934, you have the New Deal in the 1930s, bringing money for development of roadways, and Highway 7 is the first one that gets built in 1934. Those nearby in that land, they are quick to build commercial, and so they are building things that service the automobile, gas stations, etc. If you'll notice the advertisement for Syrup and Sons at the bottom, it says opposite the new high school. That's Central Community Center, so that's where it was. Highway 100 is next, opening in 1939. Here's a picture of one of the roadside parks. It was the National Park Service had dictated these roadside parks to be in a rustic style and landscape with native materials, intended to look natural, handmade, and was made by out-of-work stonemasons. 2 years later, in 1941, the very first shopping center in the state of Minnesota opens at Lilac Way. It is about 30,000 square feet. Think of Miracle Mile as about 5 times the size of that, so it's pretty small. It's today across from Miracle Mile, so where Mann Cinema and the McDonald's sits today. And then, of course, you have a big population boom just starting to happen post-war, and housing starting to come. And one of the big enablers of that is in 1934, the creation of the Federal Housing Administration, which essentially allows for private long-term mortgages. So this, for the first time, gives home ownership accessible to lots more people. So in 1939, about 1,900 homes are built. Many are the story-and-a-half bungalows that we're so familiar with. And then in the 1940s, like so many suburbs across the U.S., the veterans are pouring in. Most might hold jobs in Minneapolis, but they're trying to get out to the suburbs for housing. So we're here at 1950, and our population is now 22,000. Again, we've multiplied 5 times in the past 20 years. And on the map, you can now see Highway 7 cutting across and Highway 100 cutting north-south. You can see Lilac Way is on there now, making Excelsior Boulevard a large kind of commercial strip. But what's gone is the trolley line, so that went away in 1938 to make way for buses to use all those roads we had just built. So now we get into the 50s, and this is where things get exciting and fast, right? So 1951, Miracle Mile opens, and we have a bunch of malls get built. You have Texatonka opens up the same year. You have Westwood, the east side of it, in 54. And then, of course, the biggest one, Knollwood, in 1955. If you look at this picture, one of the things that I always love is the call out for parking, the free parking at Knollwood on the right there, and then don't forget the huge parking area in the back. So if you have dealt with Knollwood over the years, you know that parking has always been a challenge there. So similarly, we have a boom in schools. You know, they're going to follow the population again. And so between 1950 and 1968, 9 schools were built. And for a few years there, St. Louis Park had 14 public schools operating, which is tremendous for this size of a community. To give you more perspective, in 1952, there were 171 seniors in the school, but over 1,000 kindergartners. So the people building the schools could see that big influx of students were going to hit them quick. The high school would be the largest construction project in Minnesota since World War II. And in 1953, we had the largest cafeteria system in the state, serving 3,000 students every day. And if you look at population trends of surrounding neighborhoods, or Edina, Richfield, Bloomington, St. Louis Park was really the first to accelerate, and we rose the fastest. And then we level off while some of the other suburbs with more land grow. But we were big fast. In 1956, you have that high school getting ready for all those kindergartners to grow up, and you just have school after school. Aquila, Cedar Manor, Westwood, Peter Hobart, Susan Lindgren. So it is a laundry list of schools that open up in this time period. Of course, with all that has to come housing. You have a residential building boom. 1,100 building permits are issued by the city in 1950. That's the 3rd largest number in the state, behind only Minneapolis and St. Paul. Between 1950 and 1956, that's just 6 years, 66 new subdivisions were built, 2,700 new homes. In a little broader period, 8 years between 1946 and 1954, 60% of St. Louis Park's homes were built. So this is when our housing stock really pops up. We have 2 big hospital projects that open up in 59 and 69. So here we are at 1970. Our population is now almost 49,000. That's going to be our peak that we get to. And you can see on the map how everything is filled in. You can see all the new malls, the schools, the hospitals. The factories are all still there, and there's only one is closed. There was a lithium plant that had closed by then. So then we're going to finish off the last few decades pretty quickly here. The 70s business growth, there is some, big project was Scheller Park in 1971. If you're not familiar with that land, that is the very northwest quadrant of St. Louis Park, actually on the other side of 394. It had actually been annexed from Minnetonka in 1955, but not fully developed until this first tower in 1971. In the 80s, you have Byerly's and Target being built on the land that used to be a sand and brick plant. So we quickly get to 1990. You'll see our population has gone down by about 10%, and you see 8 schools have closed during that time period, so there are 6 remaining shown on the map. Almost all the industrial factories are gone by this time. There's only one left, and that's the Honeywell plant up in the north there, but its days are numbered. So I see the remaining years really about redevelopment. You have Park Commons going in where the old Lilac Way had been, Honeywell closing, and that's the new site for Home Depot and Costco in '97. 2002, you have several businesses that close and make way for Excelsior and Grand. In 2009, we have the West End moves in. And now as we look forward, there are other things like apartments on Elliott, which used to be the North Side School, housing and retail between Park Commons and Excelsior Grand, and of course the light rail, which could come in. And that would kind of fulfill Walker's vision 120 years earlier of having commuters by rail between Minneapolis and St. Louis Park. By 2020, we're projected to get our population back up to that peak of 49,000. We might have that light rail come in. You see no more factories. During this time period, we did gain a school when PSI opened in the Central Community Building, but we did lose one in Cedar Manor. And so that is the 20-minute whirlwind of development, 130 some odd years.